Wow, this is the last lecture that ends adolescent literature. So congratulations on surviving so far and hanging in there. We usually start this lecture when I teach class with this introduction. I know there's a hole punch there on the notes so that you can't see the whole word, but I usually ask students, what poets or poems do you remember from junior high or senior high school? And the ones in the brackets are ones that I remember. And usually students will say Emily Dickinson or Robert Frost. Some will say Shel Silverstein or Dr. Seuss even. So I don't know if you can relate to any of the ones that I've listed or mentioned, but that's something that just kind of jump starts us to thinking about poetry. Guidelines for choosing poems. You want to make sure that if you're choosing the poems, the vocabulary and allusions are within the grasp of the students. Now, if they're in a textbook, a reader that you have, usually someone's already thought that through for you, and that's not a problem. But if there are vocabulary words or allusions that they don't know, you would probably want to tell them those ahead of time and prep them for it so that they would be able to appreciate the poem more. The poem's context likely known and accessible to the students, or again, you'll have to do some front loading and get them ready for it. A good guideline is, if you're going to study as a unit, to use shorter poems first to reduce poetry anxiety. I didn't know there was such a term, but evidently that is so. And for some reason people, poetry, ugh. And we want to do what we can to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, one thing I have seen through the years, every once in a while you'll see somebody say that you should avoid teaching a poetry unit. I don't know about that. I think it's easier to teach it in a unit and still have poetry, different poems sprinkled throughout the year, throughout the book or the readers. But to have a clump of poems at a time does make it a lot easier to go through some of the techniques that we find in many poems. So that's kind of controversial. Some people say that that's just an overload, overkill, but I have to admit I don't agree. All right, Roman numeral 2, approaches for teaching poems. Most poetry is written to be read orally, so you do want to have an oral reading. Historical context. What is the context of the poem? When was it written? And what was going on at the time? And right along with that is who wrote it and what do we know about this person? Once you've done that, you analyze the form. Is there a form to it, or are they writing free verse or blank verse? And then discuss the ideas that are there. Connections with personal experience. There's that word connections again. And so see if there are any connections that students can make. All right, a word of caution that I've read, and I do believe, never teach a poem you don't like. If you can avoid a poem that you don't like, by all means do it. Now, sometimes we don't have that luxury, but it's a challenge to teach something that you don't like because you generally will pass that attitude on to your students, and that is not a good thing. But I certainly would encourage you to teach poetry. I've read this in, let's see, Judith Rowe Michaels' Risking Intensity, Reading and Writing Poetry with High School Students. Poetry offers students opportunities to engage with ideas, deepen language skills, stretch writing abilities, and share their own thoughts and emotions. Reading and writing poetry can help us discover profound truths we didn't realize we knew. It can waken our senses and empathy so we begin to see a new world. It can help us to know ourselves better. So there are a lot of things that we can gain from teaching reading and writing poetry. I think kids ought to know some of the great poems of the past. And how else are they going to know it if we don't teach it? Okay, ways to promote poetry. maybe a class project or a bulletin board. If they want to bring in a poem of the day, one caution, always read them ahead of time. And, maybe they can bring in one day and you read it the next day so that you have a chance to A, edit, B, practice. And a bulletin board if they want to bring in poems or write poems. And again, you will want to make sure that the spelling is correct and other things are appropriate. Ask students to bring in examples of poems from different places, like greeting cards, songs, advertisements. So many times they don't realize that all these things have to do with poetry, greeting cards even, and our songs. I've listed the student's prayer. Now we sing it frequently at Faith, but I remember the first time I ever came across it was in a literature book, and I was just profoundly moved by the thought, the content that was there. Holidays is a great time to have a poem or several poems that are around that theme. Reading aloud is another way to promote poetry. And contests of writing, finding, illustrating, etc. Maybe not even contests, but assignments. We had an Abeka book that had a series of mountain poems. And so I had my students neatly, now you can have them print them or type them and print them out, but they had to neatly write the poem on unlined paper, and then they were to illustrate it with as many colors and use as much as possible. And they did a great job, and they loved doing that. So that would be something that you could do to promote poetry. Ways to present poetry. Play a recording of someone reading poetry. One of my favorite ones is we used to get an LP out of the library. Now I guess LPs are coming back in vogue. But it would be of James Weldon Johnson reading the poems he wrote for God's Trombones. That was a book of several poems, because one of those poems was in a book that I taught. So playing that and letting him read it with dialect was a whole lot more effective than my trying to imitate that. Have students read, as far as reading it, a solo one, or choral reading, or a different student for each stanza, or of course you as a teacher could read it. Extended activities. While I was growing up in school, we had 2 different poetry notebooks that we made, and I had to have my students make poetry notebooks as well, and you have certain requirements. Maybe they have to have so many poems, they have to illustrate some of the poems, they have to include different devices, similes, metaphors, imagery. Maybe they would be around a theme or whatever. So a lot of things that you could do with that. And the kids usually enjoyed that, looking and reading poetry and, trying to come up with this poetry notebook. You can compare and contrast ads and poetry. Notice the imagery that they use and figurative language and the compressed language. Choose one poem from a group of poems by the same poet, and 2 that are really good with this, or for this, would be Robert Frost or Emily Dickinson. Side with one poet more than another. Speaking of Robert Frost, he has the poem Mending Wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. And then on the other hand, you have the other one who says good fences make good neighbors, and you have that argument going back and forth. Responding to poetry. I already said I had my students copy a poem and then illustrate it, but maybe someone will put it to music, or maybe they will write a poem based on a poem. Parody would be something that would be an example of that. Have them take a poem and write a parody, and there are some read, write, think activities that could help you out with that. Memorize a poem, recite a poem. I usually had my students do that. And I, again, would choose the poems out of our literature book. If they memorized a longer one, they got more points. If they memorized the shortest one possible, well, the best they could get would be a C, and that's if they memorized it and recited it word perfectly. I always told them that your goal is to stand there and make me think there is nothing you would rather do than to recite this poem to us. And also part of their grade was to sit there and behave while they heard others recite poetry. One of my favorite assignments was teaching seniors and have them memorize one of Shakespeare's sonnets and recite it to the class. All right, ideas for writing poetry. Write it as a class, or break in groups, or even in pairs. Have a row write a poem, or have them write it alone. Maybe you could start them, and I guess I talk about that later, but anyway, that's one thing. Magnetic poetry kits. I don't know if you've seen these, but there are little words on magnets, and you can just put that on a file or a cabinet and have them play around with those. Having them use favorite words and coming up with a poem that incorporates those. Onomatopoeia usually is something that appeals to them. Rhyming dictionary, if you can get a hold of one of these. That's one disadvantage of an online class. I'm not able to bring mine and show it to you, but that is something that I always kept in school, and they would refer to that and had a lot of fun trying to find words that rhymed. Literary terms, mentioned that a little bit, but having them apply those and write poems that implemented those. Templates. I think I gave you an example of a character poem. Sometimes it's called a bio poem. And maybe if you, again, we talk about parodies, take How Do I Love Thee or Kipling's If and use that as an example. Give them a title and then they come up with a poem, or else you could give them the first line. Maybe show them a picture and they could come up with a poem based on that. A newspaper article, an event. We had, actually we have someone in our area out here who, whenever something happens, this person will write a poem and put it in the paper, and it's a guy that works as an electrician or plumber. You wouldn't think of him as being the poetry type of guy, but that's his way of dealing with it. That's catharsis. It's after 9/11, he wrote a poem about that and put it in the paper, and they published it. So event. Acrostic, there's an example of that later on in your notes, one of the files there. List poems are also, for a while there, they were quite popular, and that would be another example of a idea for writing poetry. Or a fixed form. And there are several that are mentioned there. One that I'm going to pause and turn to for just a moment is a concrete poem. This man is not a Christian, but he is very creative. His name is John Granditz, and he has several books out. Two of them I had listed on the books that you could choose for the field trip that you took to the library and you had to look up a poetry novel or a verse novel. Blue Lipstick and Technically It's Not My Fault. You can also look them up online, and there are some examples of his poetry. So give me just a second and I will pull that up. So this poem by John Granditz is called Skateboard. You can see how not only is he writing about skateboarding, but the form matches what he says. And I think introducing this to kids, giving them some examples, and then turning them loose, that's a lot of fun to see what they come up with, because our kids are so creative, and that's a great thing to see them do. So I would like to challenge you with using poetry in your classroom. There are a couple other files that I have listed. Analyzing a poem for oral interpretation, a study guide, is helpful to you and also to them as they memorize it. And then there are some examples of poems as well that are, especially Aaron is my favorite. So I would encourage you to take advantage, do your best, and may God bless you.